Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Lea Ypi in today's show. She is Professor of Political Theory at the London School of Economics and author of the brilliant book Free: Coming of Age at the End of History. Before we start, I would like to thank Wilfried and Fabian for their kind donations, and I would like to welcome Björn, Manuel, and Gerion as patrons of Future Histories. Thank you so much, and now please enjoy today's episode with Lea Ypi. Welcome, Lea.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Just to give the audience some orientation, could you give us a rough sketch of the quite unique position of socialist Albania in the conflict between East and West in the time when you were growing up?
Yeah, so I grew up, I was born in 1979 and was growing up in Albania in the 80s and lived through the transition from being communist system to a liberal system in 1990. In the time in which I was growing up, Albania was a country with a socialist constitution, which had fallen out with every other socialist country, or at least every other socialist superpower in the world. It was also a very isolated country economically and militarily, politically, on all fronts. And the perception and the rhetoric of its own self-understanding that came through the history books and the classes in school when I was growing up was of it being this unique country that was engaged, a very small country, which was engaged in a dual fight against both Western imperialism, so Anglo-Americans on the one hand, but also Soviet and Chinese imperialism on the other. And it hadn't been like that throughout its history. So Albania became socialist in 1946 at the end of the Second World War. And it had a brief period of alliance with Yugoslavia, with which it fell out mainly for issues to do with territorial integrity and what would happen to Albania, and the reluctance of part of the Albanian socialist leadership to be part of Yugoslavia as a socialist republic, as some other projects went. And for that reason, kind of allied with the Soviet Union, but broke with the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union de-Stalinized and criticized the cult of Stalin. And Albania had this perception of itself as being the only rigorous, coherent, pure communist country in the world, which somehow also in its self-understanding entailed maintaining the cult of Stalin. And then there was this brief period of alliance with China, and then eventually also broke with China when the Chinese became too moderate. So basically, when I was growing up, it was completely on its own. And the understanding was that it was on its own, and the rhetoric was that it was on its own. And so this is how I grew up, with this idea that it was a small country that stood up to all these great superpowers for the sake of a freedom that it defended, and that we all, as citizens of that state, had a duty to defend as well.
And what I particularly liked about the book was the way in which you approach the task of opening up our collective sense of political imagination, because you do so in a, I would say, multi-directional manner. You do it by reflecting upon the past in order to learn from concrete experiences, in this case, the experiences of communist Albania and its transition to liberal democracy. And by looking at these concrete experiences, you at the same time open up a space of possibility for both critical reflection about the present, as well as the imagination of alternative futures, I would say. Would you say this is an accurate description of the book's movement?
Yeah, I think the book is very much a book that is not prescriptive in any way. And so to the extent that it has anything prescriptive in terms of how it should be understood, it really is about opening up reflection spaces and then letting readers draw their own conclusions. I'd say the overarching theme of the book is freedom and what it means to be free, and with that, connected with that, the theme of autonomy, and to kind of make decisions that you're responsible for, even though you live in circumstances and conditions in which you don't actually make all the world according to the way in which you'd want it to make. So you're kind of thrown into a world that you don't control, but somehow have to make these decisions that you do have to take ownership of and own the consequences of. And the book really does that by reflecting both at a personal level, in terms of it's a coming of age story. And so it's about an individual who discovers what freedom may or may not be, and both the kind of the promises and the disillusionments of freedom. and about a country that goes through a similar process of seeing freedom sometimes promised and sometimes betrayed, and sometimes coming as a dream, sometimes coming as a tragedy. And all of these things, I think, enable the book to operate at different levels, as you say, of criticism, both of various theories, approaches, and so abstract conceptions of, how the world should be run, and to try and think about that in context, and also, more importantly, in how they affect individuals and how they make a difference to the lives of people, but also then to reflect on the difficulties that these raise at the individual level in terms of their own people's personal choices, and how they try to navigate these transitions and the changes in the system and so on. So I would say that because it's a book on freedom, and because it's not really an abstract book on freedom, even though there are many abstract themes that permeate all its chapters, it's a book that really tries to leave the reader as free as possible in interpreting it and thinking about, what does it mean? Where is it going? What's the author trying to say? And so on. And so obviously it has a political message. I have my own political messages and so on, but I try not to say a lot more than the book already says about all these things, and to just let people draw their own conclusions from it. So it's a very open book in that sense, and more, as I say, more a book of reflection and opening up spaces for reflection than on anything more concrete and more directed and more specific.
Even though the book itself doesn't prescribe any interpretation, and this is absolutely great, I would be interested in your opinions anyway, I guess, and in the abstract ideas and your positioning towards them as well. And there's one passage in the book where you kind of dissect the new political language that is coming along with the system change, and there are different words that are new to you as a child or as a teenager, and to the public in Albania in total, I would say. Words like civil society, for example, and there's a list that you have of words that got swapped for others, and I'd like to quote some of them, because you say that civil society joined other keywords such as liberalization, which replaced democratic centralism, privatization, which replaced collectivization, transparency, which replaced self-criticism, transition, which stayed the same but now indicated the transition from socialism to liberalism instead of the transition from socialism to communism, and fighting corruption, which replaced anti-imperialist struggle, end quote. And then you state that all of these new terms that came up with this system change were connected to a word that both political systems used heavily, and that's freedom, as you already stated. Only now it was about the freedom of individual and not the collective. So maybe we could talk a bit about these different conceptions of freedom you reflect upon in the book, and how they are reflected within the different systems that you experienced, and then maybe which ideas of freedom are still unrealized and unreflected in both of these systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So that is the question of the book in a way. It's the book is a reflection on these ideas, different ideas of freedom, and how they're central to these different systems, and also in some ways in the book central to also the life orientation of the particular characters of the book. And I guess the two main ones that I try to talk about as a political theorist is the ones that have, in the intellectual tradition and history of political thought, been thought of as alternatives to each other. So on the one hand, this idea of negative freedom, and then the idea of positive freedom. And I'll say a little bit more about each of them, if I may, and then I'll say what I think about both of them and what I think comes through in the book. So there is this character in the book, which is my mother, who is a kind of arch-libertarian, and who is a post-Thatcherite figure, or a contemporary of Thatcher, or at least she's sort of modeling herself on Thatcher in her hostility to socialism, in her belief in individual responsibility, in her belief in unlimited personal freedom, which also entails the freedom to make mistakes and to let these uncoordinated structures of cooperation between individuals fail when they need to, in the way in which sometimes it's described by Hayek or these kind of authors connected to that way of thinking, and with this great resistance to the concept of the state and of bureaucracy and of administration as all abstract obstacles to the realization of this perfect individual freedom. And that's, in her conception, this freedom is close to what has often been called negative freedom because it's a freedom from. And so you are free to the extent that nobody tells you where to go, what to do, how to dress. And in those freedoms being absent consists the lack of freedom of a society. And of course, Albania, in that sense, or a communist society of that kind, and of the kind I grew up in, was a paradigmatic example of the violation of these freedoms, because you couldn't think freely, you weren't allowed to express your opinions in writing, you weren't allowed to protest, you would actually be harshly punished if you tried to leave the country. And so there's a number of domains of personal life in which individuals could not be free. And so my mother thought that, and this conception of freedom that she stands for in some way, this negative conception of freedom, is represented by this violation that Albanian communism exemplified in its most severe, most extreme form, and is gained in the transition after 1990, because it is exactly what comes. It's the ability to vote freely in elections, to have uncontrolled, uncensored political opinions, to also travel outside the country, and so on. And some of these things are the kinds of things that I put pressure on this conception of freedom when I say that the freedom from, or for example, the freedom from obstacles to traveling, isn't that robust and isn't that meaningful if you don't actually have options to. And so this takes us to a different, slightly not antagonistic, but complementary, I would say, account of freedom, which is the one that my father exemplifies in the book. So he's this character who is, some people define him as a kind of classical lefty or social democrat, but more kind of radical kind, or someone with left leanings who is very concerned by opportunities to flourish, opportunities to be who you are and to realize yourself, and who realizes also that this negative conception of freedom is not enough to guarantee that, freedom is also freedom to. It's not just freedom from. It's not just a freedom from an agent interfering with your personal choices. It's also freedom to find opportunities in a social structure that is hospitable to your choices and to your autonomy. And he's interesting because he has this alternative conception of freedom. Sometimes in the liberal literature, in the kind of classical liberal literature, so if you think, for example, of Isaiah Berlin's account of freedom, and his criticisms of negative or positive freedom, often the idea of positive freedom is represented as the idea of having an authority that actually guarantees these conditions for freedom. And so it's often presented as what you want. You can either have negative freedom, or if you want positive freedom, the positive freedom leads you to a kind of totalitarian abuse, because if it gives to a collective responsibility for the realization of the individual that are somewhat dangerous. But in some ways, you also see that positive freedom is actually what is missing in post-communist Albania in the 90s. Is precisely this idea that you are formally free, allegedly free. In fact, you have negative freedom, but what you don't have is often positive freedom in terms of the environment in which you live, the society in which you live, making accommodations to your ability to realize yourself. And so there's two examples in the book. One is the freedom of movement one, which I talk about, this idea that you can be free to leave your country. Nobody shoots you anymore at the border, but then you're trying to get into the West and the borders are closed. And so where do you go? Does that mean that you really have freedom of movement or not? If you don't have the freedom to be somewhere, as opposed to just the freedom from leaving somewhere. And in another dimension, it comes up because my father, despite him being a lefty and being very concerned by this conception, by this idea of a society that is accommodating for everyone and so on, is at one point in a position of responsibility and needs to make decisions for firing workers as a result of the structural reforms that were brought about with the help of international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and so on, and to implement what was called the shock therapy. That was a way in which people talked about how the societies of Eastern Europe had to be brought up to being up to scratch with the standards of free market societies, both political and economic. And this would entail shutting down state enterprises, privatizing wealth, and increasing the ability of individuals to take free economic initiatives, which brought a huge cost, which in some cases also entailed a rise of unemployment, for example. And my father was responsible for firing people on behalf of those who were supporting these structural reforms, which he found very difficult because to connect it to this conception of freedom, it's very hard to think that you have positive freedom if you are not able to flourish in society, and you can't flourish if you don't have a job, basically. So this is the second idea. And so there's a sense in which one might simplify by saying you can have a society in which you're guaranteed from unemployment, but you don't have freedom of speech. And another society in which you have freedom of speech, but no guarantees from unemployment. And these are deficient models of freedom, but for different reasons and on different conceptions of freedom. So that's the kind of crude, simplified picture of these two alternatives that I present.
And then there's still room for something else, isn't it? You paint a picture of these alternatives, and these are, of course, kind of prototypes of conceptions of freedom. But both of these alone miss something for sure, and we should develop some alternative which kind of brings in additional notions of what freedom could actually be like. So what is it that is still unresolved when you simply just take these two examples as if this was the whole thing that is actually possible?
Yeah, so the one that I describe in the book and that I'm interested in exploring is something that comes through my grandmother's character, and the idea that she basically, for both, from my mother and from my father, they live in unfree societies. Both of them are unfree for different reasons, but they fail to realize the promises that they make. And what's interesting about my grandmother is that she has someone who has lived through different transitions, different political systems, different political communities. She's born in this Ottoman town, Salonika, shortly before the Ottoman Empire collapsed for good, and so her identity is one of a political unit that doesn't exist anymore. And and then she came to Albania and was the wife of was first integrated in the Albanian elite and was relatively progressive. But then her husband went to prison, and so she was deported and had ended up working in labor camps and had this very difficult life under communism. And what always stood out about her was the fact that whenever you asked her to talk about her life, she never stressed the oppression. She always stressed agency. The fact that even in all these circumstances, she was able to find her direction and to take responsibility for the things that she had done. And she brought me up with this kind of inculcating me with this idea that even in the most oppressive circumstances, there is something that nobody can take away from you, which is human dignity. And in that human dignity consists freedom. And this is why partly I became later interested in exploring this idea. But for me, freedom is something that is revealed in moral agency, in your ability to make choices between the good and the bad, and to resist compromises that bring huge costs to other people. And I would say that's a more critical conception of freedom. That's neither positive nor negative freedom, but it's exactly as I call it when I talk about the book and when I talk about my favorite conception of freedom, is freedom as moral agency. And that means that this freedom of moral agency, which is revealed in the agent's capacity to see that they have this inner freedom, but they live in a world that doesn't realize these moral relations, in a world that doesn't dignify people, where you have this internal dignity, but the dignity is not recognized in the social relations between people. That's a more abstract way of talking about unfreedom than to just say it's not having the freedom to work or it's not having the freedom to talk or whatever. It's basically about what kind of social relations, what kind of political world do you want to live in? And is it possible for that world to realize this morality, this kind of core morality that we find in the individual and that is never actually taken away from? And so this is slightly different because in one way you're free always, because you're always a moral agent and you always have the capacity to discern the good from the bad. But in another way, you're also not free when you don't live in a world in which that is instantiated at the level of social relations. And so this conception of freedom as moral agency, I think, gives you a kind of critical benchmark from which you can observe and assess the circumstances of the societies in which you live. And you can also make decisions about how critical to be of those societies and how to examine the politics of those societies and to see whether they're actually realizing freedom or not.
Very interesting. I mean, this moral agency, this can hardly be independent of the socio-political structures that forms them, that kind of set the scene for the individual to act within. So how do you define this relation between the superstructure, so to speak, and the individual that should rely on this kind of moral agency? Because, I mean, this is highly entangled, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the moral agency is what enables you to be critical of the structures in which you live. And so it's what enables you to ask yourself the question of, do I live in a political environment or in an economic environment or in a social environment in which dignity is realized? And to me, that entails a range of criticisms about the absence of those freedoms in a lot of domains that we are surrounded by. And as an ideal of a kind of society that you want to live in, I think it takes you to a fully egalitarian democratic society in which democracy is central to realizing freedom in moral relations amongst all people. And the reason that takes you to a critique of both the economic and the political order and the social order in which we live is that we live in an order in which that is actually shaped by asymmetries of power of all kinds. And that can be economic power, it can be social power, it can be political power. It can be about the power of bigger states towards smaller states in the international sphere. It can be about the power of employers that have money versus vulnerable citizens that don't have money in the labor market. It can be about social relations and hierarchies of race or language or identity that kind of permeate these historical self-understandings of people. And so I think none of it is defined, but what you get from this conception is a way of criticizing what the environment in which you live in. And that can give you the kind of critical standard with which to then try and move forward from the critique and then to kind of collaborate with others as well and to work with others to try and construct something that is better.
That's very interesting, because this is again highly tied to the biographical the image that you paint of yourself as a child and maybe early teenager within the book, because there's this moment where you realize that all of the structures that had given you some kind of standing within the world, some kind of help in terms of sense making, and all of this kind of collapsed at some point where you realized that this, so to speak, moral agency that you talk about had actually been kind of absent, because you had been living within structures that were not kind of producing this moral agency within the individuals. And so you have this moment of realization that all of this actually was not given within your life up until this point, I'd say, no?
Yeah, although I think, so the thing is that there's a difference between the perspective of a child and the perspective of a grown-up. And that's why the coming of age aspect of the book is really important, because in some ways it's a book about reaching maturity and the ways in which we come to discover the truth. And in my case, and also about the importance of education and of people around you in bringing you to see these truths, or to kind of not so much to see the truth, but to see ways of thinking about the truth and accessing it. And in many ways, it's a story about the dangers of ideology and the risks that every society that we live in, every system that we are under, comes packaged with ideas or dominant discourses about how we should understand that society, how we should understand that system. And they become part of the ordinary language and part of the vocabulary with which we refer to that system, and make it very hard for us in some ways to kind of stand out. But on the other hand, it's also a story about resilience and the fact that these critical capacities are always there, as they are in my grandmother. And often being a mature person or being a moral agent is about realizing that these capacities are there. They may be more or less dormant, and they may be, depending on circumstances, more possible or less possible to be activated. But I think it's really important that they are there, because that is the only thing that enables people to rise above ideology, to rise above the given scripts, to rise above the fact that you get told slogans and that you internalize these slogans about the world in which you live. And you're never able to fully see beyond those slogans unless you discover this kind of critical capacity that is in everyone.
Interesting. I'm still kind of trying to get an idea of whether or not this kind of entails some form of essentialism, where there is this like sensor that kind of makes you realize whether something is wrong or right. It sounds a bit like that. There's a part in your book where you kind of reflect upon yourself and ask yourself whether or not you might have become someone who would have never come to a position where you would have had these moral agencies. And so this, at least within the book, it sounds as if you considered that this might have been a possibility. So this would lead us to a place where there is not a kind of sensor built within each and every individual that at the end will reveal this kind of critical capacity, but that there is indeed the possibility of like full ideology, so to speak, where this idea of critical reflection is so much like out of the realm of possibility that it is not even considered.
Yeah, so this is not in the book. It's I mean, this is not a question that I raise as a question, as a philosophical question in the book, but I can tell you what I think about it. So I think there is a kind of essentialism, which is an essentialism about reason. And it's not an essentialism about, a thing, but it's an essentialism about a capacity that only humans have to the extent that they have reason. And so the assumption that I make in my other work, not in this book, is that to the extent that people have reason, they have this capacity, and this moral capacity is the thing that is, something that you can't alienate. If you have reason, then you're able to see this, and you may be able to hear it more strongly or less strongly. So you may be a victim. Again, there's a question of nuance, and different people will be exposed to these influences in different ways. So you have to allow for the possibility, as I do in my book, that I might have become someone who was a state bureaucrat or someone who in the end absorbs a family narrative and turns against the state and becomes a dissident. And so I don't deny that personal histories and biographies condition how we think about freedom, the extent to which we're free. But I also don't want to fully allow for that. So I think it's somewhere, and this is why the book is ambiguous, and this is why perhaps the narrative voice of the book is one of ambiguity, because this is, and this is why it's really a story that works with kind of showing rather than trying to convince people that this is how it is. You can just tell different stories of different people, and you can present them with different accounts and ways of understanding themselves to make these arguments, because they're not really, it's not an either or, I think. And so, yeah, fundamentally, I am convinced that we all can see this, that even a murderer or even a kind of criminal or even someone who is pure racist or whatever has something in them that will at some point make them see that this is the wrong way to think about the world, and that that the way they are operating, what they think is right, is actually just their might in a way. And I'm kind of wedded to that worldview. It's a very but this is a very old and long and in some ways unreconcilable debate, which I think is to some extent really you only reconcile it by somehow making a leap of faith in a way in humanity and in morality and the fact that reason entails this. You can't completely resolve it. But if you don't resolve it, then you're left with very little. If you don't resolve it with this leap of faith, then that is the basis for every argument. This is the basis for democracy. It's the basis for argumentation. It's the basis on which we try to convince each other, and the basis on which we try to overcome our particularity to try and have these conversations with each other. And so if that's not there, all of these things become really difficult, because we can never leave the position from which we speak. We can never leave our stories behind. We can never leave our personal histories. We can never leave the conditioning behind. And so I think there's a sense in which you ask yourself, okay, what can you do with these two conceptions? And you discover that with the one, it's a starting point for something, for a process. And with the other, it doesn't really take you anywhere.
All right, and we want to get to places, so let's go along with this route, and ask which kind of political economies might be best suited to bring about this idea of freedoms, in plural maybe. And you briefly mentioned shock therapy. I did an episode with Isabella M. Weber on her really great book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And unfortunately, Albania did not escape shock therapy, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a strand of Future Histories that is dedicated to the question of democratic planned economies. Now, you have experienced hierarchical, non-democratic central economies, planned economies, as well as so-called liberal market economies. So I would be very much interested in your opinion on the question of democratic planned economies and their possibility. My vote would go out for some type of libertarian socialist planned economy, I'd say, which might be called in German freie Planwirtschaft. This is a tag I really enjoy, actually. Is this something you would consider, given both your experiences with different systems as well as your intellectual reflection?
Yeah, so I mean, I can speak to this, but I'm not an expert on it. So I'm not going to say anything that is particularly authoritative or informed or, that has thought through. Where my critiques take me is basically to a point of radical rejection of capitalism, I suppose, and of the monopolies of economic power and of the lack of control that the free market brings for individuals, and of the fact that there is a kind of doctrine of the free market, which happens to be precisely the shock therapy doctrine, the idea that, unintended consequences produce good things from the vices of everyone. There will be virtues, and to the extent that there are costs, these need to be borne by the individuals because it's just a matter of personal responsibility. And so there is a sense in which there is a faith in these anonymous forces of the free market that I'm not particularly keen on, because I think that's a loss of control. And if you care about freedom and agency, that's one way in which you don't have that agency. Having said that, I think there are possible alternatives and there's many models, but I'm also usually very reluctant to say which of the models is the right one, because I think it should be a matter of democratic scrutiny and debate. So what you can do is you can say, I think this is a model that really doesn't work. And so, there's some things in the world that are just plain wrong, that are actually the dominant ones in the world in which we live. There's concentrations of wealth and power by both individuals and states that on this account of freedom are very easy to point out that they're flawed and that should be rejected. But then once you've done this work of rejection, you are left with a lot of possibilities. And I don't think, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I don't think I have any particular stake or any particular insight or any particular knowledge or better knowledge than other people to say this is the way to go, this is the right model. Because my take is that a lot of these things should be subject to democratic scrutiny, and that you should create spaces for democratic interaction in which these different projects can emerge and be confronted with each other. And it's only when you have this exchange that you're actually really able to see how they go and whether you can assess them fully. It's only when they're articulated in the public sphere and when they're articulated with the help of lots of different people, not just philosophers and not just economists and not just politicians, but it's a kind of, there's a sense in which all of us contribute with our skills to articulating these views, but there is a political process through which these views need to be articulated and exchanged with each other. And then whatever emerges from this process is something that I would cherish and hold on to. But I don't want to say, I think this is the way to go either, no, because I think that's one of the problems in some ways of both actually the tradition of central planning and the tradition that came after, this idea of kind of making policy without politics, is precisely that people were so invested in coming up with the right policies that they forget that every policy should be a matter for democratic debate. And that's what I'm really keen on. Now, it may be because I'm not an expert, so I'm a political theorist, and so I care about democracy. And I think it's really important to get around this relationship between elites or experts and the public in the right way, and to articulate that relationship in the right way. And democracy helps us do that. And so, yeah, I don't think I have a lot more in terms of the specifics of the projects.
That's interesting, because I totally get it. It's absolutely important to kind of point out the critique, and you have developed an idea of freedom that allows you to point towards different forms of dysfunction where this freedom is actually not being produced within the present. But still, this must at some point have led you to at least wondering about how the kinds of freedoms that you would like to see being produced, how they could be brought about, in which kind of political economy they could be brought about. And I would say I totally understand it's not about prescribing some kind of one best way. I absolutely share that. But this doesn't mean that we should not engage in the question of how could alternatives actually look like? Because if we do not do that, then we kind of stand there with empty hands if people are rightfully frustrated with the status quo, actually. And we need to have, I would say, we need to have some kinds of ideas of how alternatives could look like, and it should be a plurality of ideas, of course, and they should be debated, but there should be ideas. I mean, I would say.
No. So I'm not saying there shouldn't be ideas. I'm just saying that I'm not the right person to articulate these political economy proposals.
I see.
That's all I'm saying. Is that I'm saying there's a division of labor in society whereby all of us do certain things and are better because of the knowledge and the stories and whatever background they have at articulating different things and bringing them in the public sphere. And I'm just not someone who is able to speak competently on the question of exactly, what political economy do we need. I'm saying that my take at a generic level takes me to a criticism of capitalism as the system in which we live. And so I think that what we should be looking at is an economy beyond capitalism. Now, how exactly that works at each level, local, national, global. At some level, it's a question of democratic debate. And so I think I would still subscribe to that. But at another level is, in that democratic debate, what does each of us contribute? And I don't contribute alternative policies because that's not what I do. And I don't know enough about that.
I see. Okay, now I get it. And but what you do actually contribute is a very concrete investigation of your own experience. And at some point at the end of the book, where you have an epilogue, you point towards a discussion group, a Marxist discussion group with some of your friends, I think in Italy or maybe Great Britain. And you state that my friend's socialism was clear, bright, and in the future. Mine was messy, bloody, and of the past, end quote. And I think what you also try, or at least it seemed to me as if what you try there is pointing us towards maybe what you just said. I'm not the one to paint a picture of a concrete alternative political economy, but what I can bring to the table is looking back at these concrete experiences, and there's something to be learned from those. So what is it that you want to show your friends from the study group and us as readers when looking at these stories, these people, these experiences? What do they bring forth?
Yeah, I think in a way, exactly what you said. So this sensitivity to history and to historical circumstances. I mean, for me, that sentence about, their socialism was in the future and mine was in the past really is a sentence about biography. Because here there are, these Western former liberals who have turned radicals, who only think about, what this future is going to be and how future society will be. And in thinking about that, dismiss the history of real world socialism as though it wasn't relevant to these kinds of thinkings about the future, to these kinds of projects. Where to me, one of the most important questions to ask is, why do societies that subscribe to these principles, why did they fail historically? What did they do wrong? And one of them is to do about the absence of democracy. This is why I kind of care so much about democracy and the fact that it's not, it's not about having the right policy, having the right principle, having the right vision. It's actually about having the right environment for enabling conversations to be had that often take a confrontational form, that where you actually have this robust possibility of picking between different alternatives, and where you radicalize democracy rather than suppressing it, as these societies historically did. Who better, who worse, who more, who less. And so there's nuances there. And to me, to put all of these societies in one big bag, as I say in the book, to say, oh, these are failed socialisms like China, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Albania. And so when they're so different and when they have all these internal debates with each other, is to be completely ignorant of the past, but in a way that is also hampering for your own thinking of the future, because there's a wealth of knowledge there and resources that you need to engage with in order to be able to reflect on possibilities for changing societies, again, compatibly with these ideals. And so I think that's the simple story in a way. So I'm encountering this group of people who only thinks about the future, and comes from a very different experience. And on the other hand, my socialism, when I came out of Albania, and that's why that sentence is there, really is just associated to the past and lacks a future. And so it's the exact opposite. I come from a place in which people think, well, socialism is done and dusted, and there is no way to think about it for the future. And I'm someone who wants to still be able to contemplate the ideas, because she thinks that there's something in the critique of capitalism, because she thinks there's something in the kind of account of democracy that is there in the thought processes and in the intellectual tradition that is important to recover. And so you have, on the one hand, a people with a wealth of knowledge about the past, but no beliefs in the future. And here you have another people who has a lot of stuff to say about the future, but doesn't want to engage with the past. And there's something missing in these interactions that I think there's a kind of gap that needs to be bridged. And it can only be bridged with, I think, an open mind to how history works, and to the fact that you never, as I say in the beginning of the book, you never make history out of your own free will, but you make it nevertheless. And it's important to engage with both of these thoughts and to hold tensions.
Brilliant. And I guess what you do with the book is exactly that. You kind of mediate between these worlds, between the also contemporary Albania and the non-futures that they like experience somewhat. What is your experience in doing that? Because I saw that you went on TV shows in Albania, so you interacted with the Albanian public on this topic. So how did they receive this book? How do they receive this whole notion of trying to get to different points of reflecting on the history of Albania and trying to gain something out of it?
I would say that it's divided. The opinion is divided, but sometimes it's divided by politics in the way in which it would be here as well. If you were to try and say, I think socialism still has a future, it's probably quite likely that you'll meet a lot of people who will say, no, socialism only has a past and this is the past. And in Albania, obviously, that's much more live because of the actual past and the kind of past that it is. So it's also somewhat understandable. The other part of the critical reception of the book is that obviously the book does a lot with the history of Albania and does a lot with Albania as such. But I also say that when here, as I'm doing here, it's also a book about ideas and kind of it's a philosophical book in many ways. And there is a worry that if you come from a small country and you've written a book that a lot of people read outside that small country and that is successful by some criterion, there is a worry that that book becomes the story of that country, which is understandable. And so I think there is a bit of reaction and resentment with that, because it's only my story. It's not everyone's story. And it's also my ideas. It's not everyone's ideas. And so there's a worry that if this is a book about Albania that explains Albanian transition to the Western world, there is a burden of responsibility on one book and one author, which an author in a book from a dominant hegemonic country doesn't usually have. But that's completely understandable that people are frustrated and sometimes resentful because they think there's another way of talking about this past which is not mine, and I share that and I understand that. So I think, but that speaks to the in some ways to the problems with the way in which the book market works and the way in which circulation of knowledge works and dominant cultures operate and how they engage with smaller cultures, which I think, as I say, it's a kind of legitimate worry, but not one that you can really bear the burden of as an author. Whereas when it comes to the politics, I think it's hard to say, because this is another question that often comes up is people say to me, are you comparing kind of socialism with liberalism? And in a way, the thing is the liberal period is still going on in Albania. So it's really hard to compare something that's complete with something that's not complete, right? And so people often read the book as a book of comparison when it's actually not. It's a book about freedom and how ideas of freedom emerge in different circumstances and by different characters. But I think it's in some ways revealing of the mindset of the country, which is about, there's these two alternatives, and one is the past and one is the future. And the one is about the future is something that we still need to hold on to. Otherwise, what do we get? We still get the past. And so it's really hard to get out of this binary logic, which is what, the country has been stuck in for the last 30 years, which was there when it's emerged, because there was this idea of the end of history. And, if it's not that. And so in some ways, I think ideologically, at least, this notion that there is no alternative is still there and is still very powerful, and perhaps not just in Albania, but also in other countries.
Yes, indeed it is. And I mean, at the end, you saw a system change in real life. So you experienced a system change. So that makes it kind of a little bit easier to see that, of course, things could be different, you know? And I mean, there are many people within Western countries for sure that still very much stick to this idea of capitalist realism, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So you have seen different systems of political economy. So you know for sure it's not true. So that's kind of a positive, I would say. In your last answer, you briefly said that you do believe that socialism has a future. So do you, because you were kind of reluctant when it comes to describing alternative political economies, like concrete alternatives, but you would say that there is something to gain when looking at specifically socialism and the communist traditions and the theoretical work and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I subscribe to. It's not that I call myself a socialist, that I am a socialist, and just as I'm an anti-capitalist. No, I was more talking about, you know, specific aspects of prescription and, you know, what concrete proposals you could make about how exactly to run, I don't know, a democratic enterprise and how to engage with the market forces when you're running a democratic enterprise. These are the kinds of more detailed things that, or you know, how to create, what would it look like exactly for the European Union to turn into a federal socialist entity, which I think what it should turn into. But I think of it as that more as a kind of democratic project that needs to be out there. I don't have a specific, fully worked out conception of how exactly it needs to be reformed along those lines. But I do think that it needs to be reformed along those lines. So yeah, that's not where my skepticism is coming from.
I see. So do you think we need some kind of new meta narratives that are able to carry this, like, pluralism of freedoms, this pluralism of different ideas that will need to be kind of democratically fought out and thought out? But do you think that we need some kind of carrier in terms of new meta narratives?
I mean, I wonder what the new meta narrative would be. For me, it's actually very simple. I think we need to be united in our rejection of the status quo as a system. I think there's a lot packed in that. But basically, people need to, for me, as I see it, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe this is another thing that needs to be tested democratically. But my conviction is that the sooner we give up on the possibility of reforming capitalism, the better off we will be in terms of thinking about alternatives. And so where you start off is by saying, I want my critique of the system in which I live to be really radical, and I want to aspire to a new foundation of a new system at a legal level, at a political level, at an economic level, at a local level, at a global level. So it's basically a kind of alternative global outlook, basically. And of course, this is not something that a single person can do, you know, and I don't think it was ever something that a single person could do. So I think it's foolish to think, okay, but do you have a theory, or do you have how is it going to work exactly? Because that's, you know, the work of a collective. But this is the starting point. To me, seems very elementary. And in fact, you wake up every day and you look at the world, and it seems pretty obvious that that's exactly what needs to happen. But maybe just, you know, Brecht used to say, the simplicity difficult to make. And that's the kind of thing that we're up against in a way that is so intuitive, that there should be an alternative system of social relations, and one that is, in a way, makes good on this promise of moral world and these promises of freedom that are in all our constitutions, in all our legal documents, in all our political rhetoric and the discourses, and yet fail miserably everywhere around us. And I think if you just point out, and in some ways the role of the book was that, to point out this gap between the ideals that we all subscribe to and the realities that we're all surrounded by. And the sooner we realize that there's a reason why the reality doesn't match the ideals, is because we're in the wrong system, the better off we will be. And the experience of engaging with, in some ways, kind of going back to these debates around 1990 and so on, is that it seems to me 1990, for all its failures and for all this, the way it went wrong, there was this possibility, this moment, this opening, where people actually thought, okay, now we could build better and we could do. There was a sort of an opening of the imagination, at least in Eastern Europe. Maybe in the West, it was never like that. Maybe the West always thought, you know, they had won and that was it. But I think in Eastern Europe, there was genuinely a moment of hope and thinking that now things would be different and people finally had agency just before they were then flooded with, the shock therapy and the liberal markets and so on. And it's that spirit of dissidence of the 90s coupled with the hope that the system can change for the better, as opposed to for some other kind of bad, that my book tries to recover and that I always try to convey.
And just to maybe for the books or for the record, I sense some kind of misunderstanding here. My question is not so much oriented towards that the idea that I think that you have the answers or one answer or anything as such. I'm perfectly aware of that it's not one person that will have this answer, but I'm still very much interested in kind of what are the agents in very much in plural, the communities, the movements, the collectives, and the meta-narratives that will together form some kind of carrier that will then move forward from the point of recognizing that the status quo is perfectly fucked up and we need to change it.
Right. So I think, there's two stories there. It's either those who experience it or those who reflect on it, right? So there are some who will experience the failings and the oppression on their skin, right? They will have it will be part of their day-to-day lives, that the way in which the system misdelivers for them, or the way in which the system betrays them, or the way in which it doesn't realize their freedoms. So there will be a sense in which the agents are the victims of the system. But there's another part in which I think it's also important that other, Kant would have called them impartial spectators. There's a lot of people out there who may not necessarily be victims, but who may reflect on the plight of those who are victims and who are engaging with the kinds of injustices and the kinds of oppressions that there are. And they are also agents. And so there is this, old debate amongst Marxists on class consciousness and whether, it's something in itself or for itself, or whether something that you can develop or something that you need to be born with. And I think I'm very open on that debate. I don't think that you have to be a victim of oppression yourself to be able to have an interest in emancipation along those lines. You can also just engage with it and see, and there's different points from which you can engage with it. But so I think the agents can be constructed by reflecting and by diagnosing the wrongs of the world, and by looking at the gaps and the cracks in the system and the failures and, different in these plural sites of struggle. There will be workers, there will be environmental crises, there will be financial crisis. All the different crises that we encounter, will each of them produce the agents that are necessary to go beyond the status quo and to try and think about the future in the right way.
And then there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, which is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Yeah, and there is an answer I always give when I get answered that question, which is that I am a Kantian and I have a duty to hope. And so there doesn't have to be anything that in the world makes me hopeful, because I think hope is a duty. And to the extent that you have reason and to the extent that you're engaging and you're in the world and you're trying to do things, then there is no alternative to being hopeful. You can't carry on if you're not hopeful. And so that's, the question of, is there anything in the world that makes me hopeful or not? I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's not important to me. There can be nothing. It could be a desert. It could be horrible. And I would still be hopeful.
Leah, thank you so much for your time and being part of Future Histories.
Thank you for having me.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.